Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. My current book, Atomic Obsession, is the main thing I'd like to talk about. An early review of this calls it annoyingly convincing. I'm not quite sure. I wasn't even trying to be convincing. So maybe you'll be annoyed or convinced or none of the above, or hopefully both of the above, maybe. The book is designed, during the course of publishing history, there have been a very large number of books which have been effective cures for insomnia. It's my, in this case, however, I think this may be the first book ever written in which that's the author's intention. The book is really designed basically to put you to sleep, not in, I hope, because it's incredibly boring or anything, but because concerns about atomic weapons have been so prevalent. For example, here's a statement by Defense Secretary Robert Gates. Every senior leader, when you're asked what keeps you awake at night, it's the thought of a terrorist ending up with a weapon of mass destruction, particularly nuclear. This is FBI Director Robert Mueller, somebody watching him very carefully as he thinks. There are dark circles under his heavy-lidded brown eyes. When he utters the words nuclear device, he knits his brow and clenches his teeth. At one point, when he is discussing the possibility of a nuclear threat from terrorists, an anxious thought lifts his left eyebrow like an arrow poised in mid-flight. The former CIA investigator, who's now at Harvard, Rolf Mowatt Larsen, has similar problems, apparently. He knows most surely with each passing minute that we are blind without moles, that Al-Qaeda is looking for uranium. There's plenty of it out there. With as little as 35 pounds, a sophisticated group could build a Hiroshima-sized bomb. We'd never see it coming. That's why he can't sleep. He's growing grim, sepulchral. He hasn't touched his corn muffin. Okay, well, what I'd like to do is, if my book is successful, we'll have a lot more sleep going on in Washington, and therefore, I hope, better decision-making. And if that happens, I intend to take full credit for it. What I'd like to do is talk about several aspects which are in the book, and we'll have time for questions afterwards if you want to go into some of these in more depth or hit me from other angles. The basic point of the book in many respects is that nuclear weapons have not been very important, and they're not very significant historically, and their spread is not terribly important, and nuclear terrorists are very unlikely to get them. Let me try to explain some of those. To begin with, nuclear weapons are awesome, but hardly apocalyptic. Their destructive power has been very commonly exaggerated. For example, this is a picture of Hiroshima, obviously a terrific amount of devastation. Another picture there. But as Spencer Wert, a historian of this era, talks about, he says, when you say nuclear bomb, everybody immediately thinks of the end of the world. And so what I'm concerned about is that I think it has consequences that people basically just sort of, their mind stops as soon as you say atomic bomb, like it is the end of the world. It obviously wasn't the end of the world. This is Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial, and this is what Hiroshima looks like now. My concern basically is I certainly do think nuclear weapons are extraordinarily destructive, obviously the most destructive weapon that's ever been invented, but one bomb is not the end of the world. But nonetheless, you have people like, to give you a couple of examples of the kind of exaggeration that's been out there. J. Robert Oppenheimer, after World War II, was asked about, if 3 or 4 men could smuggle atomic bomb units, could they blow up New York? And he said, yes, they could blow up New York. Well, if you take the kind of bombs that existed, the nuclear bombs that existed, and blew them up on the ground in New York, the amount of with that bomb, the amount of damage you do would be, you would blow up essentially 1% of New York. Now, so Oppenheimer, when he says you can blow up New York, is basically exaggerating by a factor of 100. Now, I don't want to say that a bomb going off in New York wouldn't be a catastrophic event. What I'm arguing is that this kind of cosmic exaggeration by a factor of 100 by somebody who should know better strikes me as being a very bad idea. A similar argument was made in Nature recently. This is the big scientific magazine in England and just earlier this year in January 2009, An editorial says, even a fizzle of a HEU, highly enriched uranium device, would take out most of Manhattan. Well, a fizzle of an HEU device would basically be the kind of bombs that have been exploded and tested so far by North Korea. If one of those was set off in the middle of Central Park in New York, it would not destroy any buildings on the periphery. So the idea that a fizzling of a tiny bomb like that, a small, I mean, if it's in Times Square, it'd do a lot of damage, obviously. But the point is, it's very constrained, and sort of the idea that somehow the whole world comes to an end, that all of Manhattan gets taken out by that, is just basic nonsense. There's also the argument that it has a huge social effect. For example, George Tenet, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, said this in his recent book. If they manage to talk about terrorists, if they manage to set off a mushroom cloud, they'll make history. I certainly agree with that. Such an event would put al-Qaeda on a par with the superpowers. In other words, if they can come up with one tiny bomb, that's the same as a country that has 10,000 of them. And they make good bin Laden's threat to destroy our economy. One mushroom cloud would destroy the economy of the United States. Well, if a bomb goes off in Peoria, that would be a really bad thing, or in Columbus, Ohio, that'd be a really, really bad thing. But the idea that the whole rest of the country would fall apart, everybody just goes home and starves to death or something like that, strikes me as just being ridiculous kind of exaggeration. And these people are never basically queried about that. They just this kind of hyperventilating has been taking place now for decades, and I'm trying to put that at least in a degree of context. Once again, I do want to stress that nuclear weapons are terrible and they can kill lots of people. It's just that one bomb like that isn't the end of the planet, and we've had years and years of that. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the extrapolation that's gone beyond that to not only to nuclear weapons, but now there's been a new category known as weapons of mass destruction. These are the phrase has been around for quite a long period of time, but it only got really inflated and became very common in the 1990s, basically, in the first Bush administration and under Clinton administration. And so what has happened is that nuclear weapons, which definitely are weapons of mass destruction, was in there, but then also added were chemical weapons and biological weapons, both of which are probably not weapons of mass destruction. Chemical weapons basically are extraordinarily difficult to control, and they're almost incapable of committing mass destruction. A single one. A lot of them potentially could, but a single one can't. For example, in World War I, the number of people killed by chemical weapons represented about 0.7% of the deaths in World War I, where they were used, quite extensively. Some biological weapons could be quite, killed tens or even hundreds of thousands of people, but for the most part, they're extremely hard to control. Shinriko, the Japanese terrorist group, tried to develop a biological weapon, set off several of them. Not only didn't they kill anybody, but no one even noticed. Now beyond that, there's also been sometimes radiological weapons are added to the list. Radiological weapons are in their most likely form for terrorists in particular are basically incapable of killing anybody. What they would do, except by if there's an explosion to disperse the radioactivity, then somebody might be killed by the explosion. But the radioactivity basically what would happen would be in a relatively small area. Radioactive background radiation would go up some, such that if you follow the fairly conventional categories, what would happen is if you stayed in that place for 40 years nonstop, your chance of getting cancer would go up by maybe 0.1%. That's not a weapon of mass destruction, it seems to me. So it's more inconvenience than anything else, and no one ever talks about that. And the danger would be that somebody would set off a dirty bomb, as they're called, a radiological bomb in an NFL stadium, and people would panic to get away. Well, actually, they have 40 years to get away. So what they should know is, okay, that's a bad thing, so walk away. But no one ever basically says that. In addition, there's been now legally a definition on the books now of weapons of mass destruction, which includes which hand grenades would be considered weapons of mass destruction, Revolutionary War muskets. Now you know why the shot was heard around the world. it was a weapon of mass destruction, and also those bombs bursting in air that Francis Scott Key was so impressed by. Those would be counted as weapons of mass destruction. So you got exaggeration on top of exaggeration.